The silence had a weight here. It pressed down on Marin's shoulders, heavier than the thin wool of her sacrificial dress. It sank into her bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the drafts whispering through the great hall. In her father's keep, silence had been a rare and precious thing, a stolen moment between the clang of steel and the shouts of men. Here, in the heart of the Alpha King's fortress, silence was a predator. It coiled in the shadows that clung to the high, vaulted ceiling. It slithered across the flagstones, worn smooth by the footsteps of ghosts. It listened. Marin's own breath was a traitor, too loud in the stillness. Her heartbeat was a frantic drum, counting down the seconds she had left. She stood on the dais, a lone figure before a throne of polished obsidian and iron. They had placed her there an hour ago and left without a word. Her instructions had been simple. Do not speak. Do not look away. Do not run. Running was a laughable thought. Where? Would she go? The mountain pass was already choked with the first snows of winter, and the forest that surrounded the king's lands was said to hunt men for sport. No. There was no escape. There was only the waiting. A scent drifted on the air, cutting through the sterile cold of stone and the faint metallic tang of old blood. It was pine and frozen earth, sharp and clean and achingly vast, the smell of the wilderness that owned this mountain. It was his scent. She knew it instinctively. Her pulse stumbled. The air refused to move, caught in the throat of the hall. The torches flickered, their flames suddenly small and afraid. A sound echoed from the far end of the corridor. A single footstep, heavy, deliberate, the sound of a glacier moving, unstoppable and ancient. Another followed, and another, each one a hammer blow against the anvil of her fear. The great doors at the end of the hall swung inward, moved by a force she could not see. And he was there. He was a king carved from winter's shadow. Marin had heard the stories. They called him the Beast of the North, the moon-cursed king. They said his eyes were chips of ice and his heart was a stone. They whispered that he devoured the flesh of his brides, a blood sacrifice to appease the curse that ran through his veins. The stories had not done him justice. He was taller than any man she had ever seen, broader at the shoulder than a northern ox. A cloak of black wolf fur fell from his massive frame, dark as a starless night. His hair was the color of iron, streaked with silver, and it fell past his shoulders, untamed, but it was his presence that stole the air from her lungs. It was a physical force, a wave of pressure and absolute authority that washed over her, demanding submission, demanding she fall to her knees. Her legs trembled, threatening to obey. He walked toward the dais, his pace unhurried. He did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on the throne that waited behind her, as if she were nothing more than a piece of furniture, an object left in his path. The guards stationed along the walls, hulking men in dark leather and steel, bowed their heads as he passed. Not a single one dared to meet his eyes. He smelled of the wild mountain, of ozone and old snow and something broken. He stopped at the base of the dais, 3 short steps below her. The sheer size of him was overwhelming. He was a creature of myth, not of men. For a long, terrible moment, he did nothing. He just stood there, breathing. The sound of his breath was low and steady, a quiet rumble that seemed to shake the very stones beneath her feet. She kept her eyes lowered, fixed on the worn leather of his boots. It was all she could do to keep from flinching when he finally moved. He ascended the steps. 1, 2, 3. He stood before her now, so close she could feel the chill radiating from his body, a palpable aura of frost. She risked a glance upward, just for a second, past the hard line of his jaw to the scar that had cut from his left temple down across his cheek. It was an old wound, silvered with time, but it pulled at the corner of his mouth, giving him a permanent, wolf-like snarl. His eyes found hers. The stories were wrong. They were not chips of ice. They were molten silver, luminous and feral, burning with a cold fire that seemed to see straight through her skin, into the terrified flutter of her soul. He saw the scars on her wrists. She knew he did. Faint, pale lines from a time she fought to forget. He saw the tremble in her hands, and the fear that had stolen her voice. He saw a lamb, ready for slaughter. A muscle tightened in his jaw. His expression was one of bored ritual, of a man weary of a ceremony he was forced to endure again and again. He raised a hand. It was huge, the fingers long and calloused. Scars crisscrossed the back of it, a map of countless battles. He reached for her, not with gentleness, but with the grim finality of an executioner. This was it, the joining, the final act of the farce that had been her life. Sold by her father to save his failing lands. delivered like livestock to a monster. She forced her own hand upward, offering it to him. It shook violently, a leaf in a storm. His fingers closed around hers. The touch was not fire. It was frost that burned. An impossible, searing cold shot up her arm, straight to her heart, making it seize in her chest. A gasp escaped her lips, a tiny, wounded sound. But it wasn't just the cold. The moment his skin met hers, something happened. A jolt, a current of energy that arced between them, violent and raw. It was not passion. It was power, ancient and untamed. A sound tore from his throat. It was not a word. It was a growl, low, guttural, and utterly inhuman. It rumbled through his chest, a vibration she felt through his hand, up her arm, rattling her teeth. His silver eyes widened, the bored indifference shattering like glass. The molten silver flared, ignited by a sudden, shocking awareness. He finally saw her, his head tilted, and his nostrils flared almost imperceptibly. He was scenting her, like a wolf scents its prey, and the curse in his blood awakened. She felt it, a dark, coiling thing that lived inside him, a beast that had been sleeping. It stirred, drawn out by her touch, by her very presence. It uncurled from the depths of his soul and tasted the air around her. His grip tightened, not painful, but absolute. There was no escape now. He held her hand as if he were holding his own destiny, and his knuckles were white. He leaned down, his face lowering to hers until his breath, smelling of winter and bloodlust, ghosted across her cheek. The air between them crackled. The world narrowed to the space of a single heartbeat. His gaze was no longer distant. It was sharp, predatory, hungry. He was looking at her as if he'd been starving for 1,000 years and she was the first meal he'd seen. "What?" he whispered, his voice a rasp of gravel and thunder. "Is that scent?" The question was not for her. It was for the ancient, howling thing inside him. The mark of the curse on his chest, hidden beneath layers of leather and wool, began to burn against his skin. And beneath her own skin, something answered. His question hung in the air, a poisoned dart. What is that scent? Marin's mind went blank. Scent? She smelled of fear, of the lye soap they had scrubbed her with until her skin was raw, of the damp wool of a dress she hadn't chosen. She was the scent of poverty and desperation, the smell of a life sold cheap. But the look in his eyes, it said something else. The molten silver burned with a terrible, consuming curiosity. The beast inside him, the one she had felt stir, was awake now. It was staring at her through his eyes. And it was hungry. His grip on her hand was a manacle of bone and flesh. He moved. It was not a step. It was a surge of power. He tugged her forward, pulling her from the dais as if she weighed nothing. Her feet stumbled on the hem of her own dress, and she would have fallen if not for the iron strength of his hold. He dragged her past the obsidian throne, down the steps, and across the great hall. The guards, they did not move. They did not speak. They kept their heads bowed, their faces impassive masks of stone. They were statues in the king's private storm. He was a whirlwind of black fur and silent rage, and she was the twig caught in his vortex. The hall was left behind. The heavy doors boomed shut, swallowing the flickering torchlight and the suffocating weight of the court's unseen gaze. They were plunged into a corridor of near darkness. Here, the cold was different. It was older, deeper. It clung to the stone walls and settled in the marrow of her bones. His scent was overwhelming in the enclosed space, pine and snow, and the sharp, clean smell of a lightning strike. It filled her lungs, choking her. His silence was the most terrifying thing of all. He did not speak. He did not explain. He simply moved forward, his long, relentless strides forcing her into a half-run to keep up. The rough fabric of her dress scraped against her legs. The stone floor was ice beneath her thin slippers. All she could hear was the whisper of his cloak against the stone, the heavy, deliberate fall of his boots, and the frantic, rabbit-fast beat of her own heart. He was not taking her to a sacrificial altar. He was not taking her to the dungeons. The path he took felt personal, deeper into the fortress, deeper into the heart of his power. He stopped before a door of iron-banded oak, so massive it seemed grown from the mountain itself. He did not use a key. He slammed his free hand against it, and the thick bar on the other side lifted with a deafening groan. He shoved the door open and pulled her inside. The room was vast. A fire roared in a hearth large enough to roast a whole ox, its flames casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the stone walls. Fur's wolf, bear, and shadow cat were thrown across a bed so large it looked like a battlefield. The air was thick with his scent, a concentrated predatory musk. This was his den. He finally released her. She stumbled back, her hand throbbing with a phantom ache where his fingers had been. She collided with the cold, unyielding wood of the door, which he pushed shut with a flick of his wrist. The sound of the bar falling back into place was a death sentence. The latch echoed in the sudden quiet. She was trapped, alone with the beast. He did not turn to her immediately. He walked toward the fire, his back a wall of black fur and muscle. He braced his hands on the stone mantelpiece, his head bowed, his massive shoulders rising and falling with each controlled breath. He was fighting. She could feel it. A war was raging inside him. The king versus the curse, the man versus the monster. Maren pressed herself against the door, trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear into the grain of the wood. Her breath came in shallow, silent sips. She watched him, every muscle in her body screaming at her to run, though there was nowhere to go. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, ready to snap. The only sound was the crackle and spit of the fire. He was waiting, or listening, or wrestling with the howling thing that lived in his blood. When he finally turned, the firelight carved his face into a mask of brutal light and shadow. The boredom was gone. The weary ritual was forgotten. His silver eyes were fixed on her, and the hunger in them was a living thing. He began to move. He stalked the edge of the room, circling her, never taking his eyes off her. He moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, the way a wolf circles a cornered deer, assessing, scenting, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She did not move. She barely breathed. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic prisoner against its cage. He stopped 10 feet away from her, his head tilted again, that same predatory gesture as before. His nostrils flared. He was breathing her in, trying to decipher the scent that had derailed his ancient, bloody ritual. "They told me your name was Maren," he said. His voice was different in this room. Deeper, softer, yet somehow more dangerous. A low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "From the Avel clan in the southern foothills, a daughter of a coward who sold you for 3 seasons of good harvest." She flinched at the truth of it, the words a slap across the face. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "They told me your bloodline was weak," he continued, his voice dropping even lower. "That you were wolfless, barren, an omega with nothing to offer but a warm body to break the curse's fever for another moon cycle." His eyes narrowed. They lied. Maren's throat tightened. A lie? Her entire life had been shaped by those truths. She was the flawed one, the disappointing daughter, the one who could not shift, whose presence was a drain on the pack's resources. She was nothing. He took a step closer, and another. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken violence. "Every bride they have brought me for 100 years has smelled the same," he growled, the sound vibrating with a century of frustration. "They smell of fear, of perfume, of fertile flesh ripe for the claiming. They smell of life." He was in front of her now, close enough that she had to crane her neck to look up at him. The heat from his body washed over her, a furnace of contained power. "But you," he whispered, leaning down. The scent of pine and winter was so strong it made her dizzy. "You do not smell of life." He raised his hand, slowly, as if not to spook a wild animal. He did not try to touch her hand this time. He reached for her face. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the blow. For the claws, for the teeth. Instead, she felt the rough pad of his thumb ghost over her cheek, just below her eye. The touch was impossibly light for a man so large. It was a question. "You smell," he murmured, his voice a raw, confused thing. "Like peace." Her eyes flew open. His face was inches from hers. The silver flames in his eyes were burning, not with rage, but with a desperate, agonizing hope. The beast was there, but it wasn't snarling. It was kneeling. "That scent," he breathed, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "It quiets the howl. It soothes the fire in my blood." For the first time in a century, the gnawing, endless agony of his curse receded. It did not vanish, but it drew back, hushed by her proximity, silenced by a fragrance he couldn't name. It was like starlight on snow, like the last breath of a dying ember, faint, almost nothing, and yet it was everything. He stared at her, truly seeing the frail creature before him, the faint scars on her wrists, the tremor in her lips, the deep, soul-crushing terror in her eyes. She was a sacrifice, yes. A lamb, sent to the slaughter. But not for him. A horrifying realization dawned in his gaze, clearing the fog of his own pain. He had been a fool. Her father, the council, all of them. They hadn't sent her to him to be a bride. She wasn't the cure. She was the weapon. He pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned. The sudden loss of his touch was a shock, leaving her skin cold and tingling. "You will not die tonight," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of its earlier heat. The king was back, the walls of ice slamming back into place. A tiny, fragile bud of hope tried to bloom in Marin's chest. "Not die?" He looked down at her, his expression grim, his face a mask of stone once more. He saw the flicker of relief in her eyes and his mouth twisted into a bitter line, a snarl of self-loathing. He leaned in one last time, his breath a cold whisper against her ear, killing that hope before it could ever take root. "The moon does not want your death," he rasped, his voice a promise of purpose, a fate far worse. "She wants your soul." He left her there. The words, a chilling prophecy, echoed in the vast chamber long after the iron-banded door had boomed shut behind him. "The moon wants your soul." Marin didn't move. She stood frozen, her back pressed against the cold, unyielding oak, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and terror. She was not to die tonight. It should have been a relief, a reprieve from the execution she had been promised. Instead, it felt like a crueler sentence. The king's den was a cage of shadows and secrets. The fire roared, consuming the logs with a hungry, relentless appetite, much like the beast that lived in its master. Furs, dark and heavy, were piled on the bed, holding the memory of his scent, his weight, his violent dreams. This was the room where his brides had waited, where they had breathed their last breaths. She could almost feel their ghosts in the air, their fear a faint, lingering stain on the silence. But she was different. "You smell like peace." The thought was absurd. Her entire life had been a war, a quiet, internal struggle against the shame of being wolfless, against the pitying glances of her pack, against the cold disappointment in her father's eyes. Peace was a foreign country she had never been allowed to visit. Yet the Alpha King, the monster from the stories, had looked at her and seen stillness. She pushed herself away from the door, her legs trembling. The room was intimidating, a reflection of the man who ruled it. Everything was oversized, made of dark wood, iron, and stone. A massive table was strewn with maps and ancient scrolls, held down by daggers and polished stones. On a stand in the corner, a suit of black steel armor stood sentinel, its surface scarred and dented from 100 battles. It was the domain of a warrior, a king, a predator. She was an omega, a broken thing. She drifted toward the fire, drawn by its warmth, its life. She held her shaking hands out to the flames, feeling the heat chase away some of the deep, gnawing chill. What did he mean? How could her scent, the scent of nothing, soothe the legendary curse that plagued him? The stories said the moon goddess herself had cursed his bloodline for a betrayal so profound the sky had wept for 3 days. The curse manifested as a madness, a bloodlust that grew with the waxing moon, demanding a sacrifice to keep it from consuming him completely. A bride for every full moon, a life to buy another month of sanity. But her life was not the price, it was her soul. A shudder racked her body. She wrapped her arms around herself, the thin wool of her dress, a poor defense against the terror that had taken root in her heart. Hours passed. The fire burned low, the roaring flames sinking into a bed of glowing, breathing embers. The shadows in the room grew longer, deeper, until the corners of the chamber were lost to a thick, inky darkness. No one came, no guards, no servants. She was left utterly alone in the heart of the beast's lair. Was this a test? Was he waiting for her to break, to scream, to claw at the door until her fingers bled? The thought exhausted her. She had no fight left. Her father had taken it. Her pack had taken it. The long, hopeless journey to this fortress had taken the last of it. She was empty. Drawn by a weariness that went bone deep, she moved toward the enormous bed. It was not a place of comfort, but it was the only soft thing in this room of stone and steel. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the thick pelt of a black wolf. Its fur was impossibly soft, a whisper of luxury she had never known. It smelled of him, pine, snow, power. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion. She didn't lie down. She just sat, a small, hunched figure in the vast, empty space, and watched the embers die. Sleep claimed her without her permission. A fitful, dreamless void that offered no rest, only a temporary escape from the waking nightmare. A sound woke her, a low, guttural growl. Her eyes snapped open. The room was dark, the fire nothing more than a faint, pulsing red eye in the hearth. A sliver of moonlight, pale and cold as a bone, sliced through a high window, painting a single stripe across the floor. And in that stripe of moonlight stood the king. He was not wearing his cloak or his leathers. He was stripped to the waist, his broad chest and powerful arms bare. The moonlight kissed the landscape of his skin, illuminating a roadmap of scars. Old ones, new ones, some thin and white like whispers, others thick and jagged like screams. But it was the mark on his chest that stole her breath. It was a swirling vortex of black ink, a tattoo that seemed to move, to writhe like a living thing. It started over his heart and spiraled outward, its tendrils snaking over his collarbone and down his ribs. It looked like a storm cloud, a captive piece of the night sky filled with rage. This was the curse, made manifest. His head was bowed, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The muscles in his back and shoulders were coiled tight, knots of pure, agonizing tension. The growl came again, ripped from his throat. It was not a sound of aggression. It was a sound of pain, pure, undiluted agony. He was fighting it, the howling thing inside him. And he was losing. He hadn't seen that she was awake. He thought he was alone with his demon. He stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the great table. A low snarl escaped his lips, his teeth bared in the faint light. His silver eyes, when he lifted his head, were wild. The pupils were blown wide, swallowing the silver until they were almost completely black. The beast was in control. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the fog of sleep in Marin's mind. She scrambled back on the bed, pulling her legs up, trying to make herself a smaller target. Her movement, small as it was, caught his attention. His head snapped toward her. The black eyes locked onto her. A new sound rumbled in his chest. A deep, possessive purr of sound. It was the sound of a predator that had just found its prey. He pushed himself off the table and began to move toward her. He wasn't stalking this time. There was no grace, no control. Each step was heavy, dragging, as if he were wading through thick mud. The man was fighting the wolf for every inch of ground. "Stay! Back!" The words were a mangled wreck, forced through clenched teeth. It was the king, his voice raw with the effort of holding the monster at bay. But the monster was stronger. It wanted her. It wanted the peace it had scented. He was 5 feet from the bed now. She could smell the change in him. The scent of pine and snow was still there, but it was tainted by something else, something hot and metallic. The smell of bloodlust. The curse on his chest was glowing. A faint, sickly silver light pulsed from the black ink, in time with his tortured heartbeat. It was feeding on his pain, growing stronger. He reached the edge of the bed and braced his hands on the frame, leaning over her. His shadow fell across her, a wave of darkness that threatened to drown her. He was panting, his breath coming in ragged, harsh gasps. The beast stared down at her, its hunger a palpable force. It wanted to consume her, to devour the stillness in her soul and make it its own. But the man was still there, buried deep inside, fighting. "Marin," he gasped, his own name for her a desperate prayer. She didn't know why she did it. It wasn't a choice. It was an instinct, a foolish, suicidal instinct, born from a lifetime of trying to soothe the anger of others. She reached out her hand, slowly, trembling. She didn't reach for his face or his arm. She reached for the scars on his chest, for the source of his pain. Her fingers, small and pale against his skin, touched the edge of the swirling black mark. His entire body went rigid. A roar of pure, unadulterated agony tore from his lungs, shaking the very foundations of the room. It was not the roar of a beast. It was the roar of a man being ripped in two. His skin was fire. The curse was ice. The collision of the two extremes sent a shockwave through her arm, a jolt so powerful it made her teeth rattle. But she didn't pull back. She held her ground, her small hand pressed against his tormented flesh. She felt the desperate, frantic thrum of his heart beneath her palm. She felt the cold fire of the curse fighting her touch, trying to push her away. She looked past the monster, into the depths of his wild eyes, and tried to find the king. "Errand," she whispered. His name. A word she had no right to speak. It was a fragile shield against the storm. His eyes widened. The blackness receded for a split second, a flicker of molten silver returning. He heard her. The man heard her. He collapsed. Not forward, onto her. He fell back, away from the bed, landing on his knees on the cold stone floor. He hunched over, his head in his hands, his body racked with violent tremors. The silver light in the tattoo faded, the angry pulsing slowing, receding back into dormant ink. The beast had not been vanquished, but it had been forced back into its cage. Maren was left on the bed, her hand outstretched, her fingers tingling with the memory of his burning skin and the curse's icy heart. She had touched the monster, and for a single, terrifying moment, it had answered with the king's name. Silence descended, heavy and absolute. It was a different silence than the one that had greeted her in the great hall. That had been the silence of predation, of waiting. This was the silence of aftermath, the quiet that follows a storm, when the air is still charged with ozone and the world holds its breath, waiting to see what has been broken. Errand knelt on the stone floor, his head in his hands. His massive shoulders shook, not with rage, but with the tremors of a battle barely won. The curse on his chest was quiet, the sickly light gone, leaving only the dark, swirling ink against his scarred skin. He was breathing in deep, ragged gulps, dragging air into his lungs as if he'd just surfaced from a drowning. Maren sat on the edge of the bed, her own heart a wild drum against her ribs. Her hand, the one that had touched him, tingled with a strange residual energy, a phantom echo of fire and ice. She had whispered his name, a king's name, an intimacy she had no right to claim. He had collapsed. She should have been afraid. The logical part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive through years of quiet submission, screamed at her to flee, to press herself into the farthest, darkest corner of the room and pray he forgot she existed. But she couldn't move. She could only watch the broken king on the floor. He was not a monster. Not entirely. He was a man locked in a cage with a beast, and tonight she had seen the bars begin to break. And somehow, her touch, her voice, it had helped him force the beast back. Slowly, he lifted his head. In the faint, dying glow of the embers, she saw his face. The feral madness was gone from his eyes. The black had receded, leaving the molten silver, now clouded with a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. He looked ancient, worn down by a century of fighting a war no one else could see. His gaze found hers. There was no hunger in it now. No threat. There was something far more terrifying. Awe. He looked at her as if she were a miracle, a ghost, a myth he'd stopped believing in. He pushed himself to his feet, his movements stiff and weary. He did not come closer. He stood by the hearth, one hand braced against the cold stone, using it for support. He wouldn't look at her directly, his gaze fixed on the dying embers. "What did you do?" His voice was a rasp, stripped raw. Maren swallowed, her throat dry. I don't know. Don't lie to me." The command was soft, but it held the unyielding weight of his authority. No one has ever. The curse has never. It does not retreat. It was a statement of fact, a law of his existence. For 100 years, the curse had only ever advanced, its hunger growing with each passing moon. It did not know how to surrender. "I only said your name," she whispered, the words barely audible. He finally turned his head, his silver eyes pinning her in place. "My name," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "The brides before you screamed it. They begged. They cursed it." He took a half step toward her, his expression a mask of desperate confusion. "But when you said it, it was not a plea. It was an anchor. An anchor." The word settled in her chest, heavy and strange. She, who had been adrift her entire life, had somehow become an anchor for a king drowning in his own blood. He saw the fear and confusion on her face, and a flicker of something regret, self-loathing, crossed his features. He stopped, keeping a safe distance between them. The scent. He murmured, more to himself than to her. "It is not a cure. It is a shield. Your presence dulls its teeth. Your touch." He looked at his own hand, then back at her. "It starves the beast." He was piecing it together, the warrior king analyzing the battlefield of his own soul. He had been looking for a way to break the curse, a ritual, a sacrifice, a final, bloody end. He had never considered that the answer might be quiet. that it might be an Omega girl with nothing to her name but a scent he couldn't define. The air in the room shifted. The dynamic between them, so clearly defined as predator and prey, captor and captive, was fracturing. Something new was being forged in the embers of his pain and her fear. "You are not a sacrifice," he said, his voice gaining strength, the king returning to his throne of words. "You are a key." Maren shook her head, a small, helpless gesture. "I don't understand." "Neither do I," he admitted, and the honesty of it was more shocking than any roar. "But I know this. You were sent here to kill me. Not with a blade, but with this. With hope. The moon is cruel. She would not give me a weapon to end my curse. She would give me a reason to fight, only to rip it away." He saw it now. The shape of the trap. He was meant to cling to her, to this newfound peace she offered. He was meant to rely on her, and when the next full moon came, when the beast was stronger than ever, her presence would not be enough. The beast would consume her peace, and then it would consume him. It was the most exquisitely crafted torture. He looked at her then, truly looked at her. A girl sold by her family, sent to a monster's den, shivering on the edge of his bed, looking at him not with hatred, but with a terrifying flicker of pity. Something in his chest, a thing he thought had turned to stone a century ago, cracked. He strode to a heavy wooden chest at the foot of his bed and threw it open. He rummaged inside, his movements brusque, angry. He pulled out a thick, fur-lined cloak. It was made of soft, gray wolf pelts, far finer than the rough dress she wore. He walked to the bed and threw it over her shoulders without a word. The fur was heavy, warm, and it smelled of him, pine and winter and a faint trace of wood smoke. It was an impossibly intimate gesture. It was a shield. He was protecting her, from the cold, from this place, from himself. She clutched the edges of the cloak, pulling it tighter around her, the warmth a shocking comfort. "Get some sleep," he commanded, his voice rough, turning his back on her as if he couldn't bear to look at her any longer. "You will stay in this room. You will not leave. Servants will bring you food. You will speak to no one." It was a prisoner's sentence, but the tone was not that of a jailer. It was that of a man desperately trying to protect the one fragile thing in his world. He walked to the massive table, lit a single candle, and sat down, his back to her. He picked up a scroll, unrolling it with unsteady hands, pretending to read the ancient script, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid set of his spine. He was standing guard. Maren lay back on the bed, pulling the heavy furs over her body. She did not take off the cloak he had given her. She curled into its warmth, her head resting on a pillow that smelled of him. She watched the candlelight flicker across his broad, scarred back. He did not move, a silent, unmoving sentinel in the dark. For the first time in her life, Maren felt safe. It was a mad thought. To feel safe in the den of the Beast King, the man who was meant to devour her, to be protected by the very monster she was supposed to fear. But the real monster wasn't him. It was the curse that hunted him. And tonight, she had helped him fight it. She closed her eyes, the scent of pine and winter filling her senses. The steady, quiet presence of the king watching over her was a strange and powerful lullaby. Just before sleep took her, a quiet voice, her own, spoke in the back of her mind. He had called her an anchor, but as she drifted off to sleep, wrapped in his cloak, in his scent, she wondered if perhaps he was hers too. The first solid thing she had ever had to hold on to, in a life spent drowning. The days that followed were a strange, silent truce. True to his word, Aaron kept her a prisoner in his chambers, but it was a gilded cage. Twice a day, a timid servant with downcast eyes would leave a tray of food outside the door, knock once, and flee before Maren could even reach the handle. The food was rich and plentiful, smoked meats, soft cheeses, warm bread, things she had only ever dreamed of. He provided her with clothes, simple tunics and leggings of soft wool, far warmer and more comfortable than the sacrificial dress she had arrived in. They appeared on the chest at the foot of the bed each morning while she slept, laid out by a ghost. Aaron himself was a ghost. He was there, and he was not. He would disappear for hours, sometimes for an entire day, attending to the duties of a king she could not imagine. He would return in the dead of night, silent as a shadow, and take up his vigil in the chair by the hearth. He never slept in the bed. The vast expanse of furs and linens was hers alone. They rarely spoke. The silence between them was no longer the heavy, predatory thing it had been on that first night. It had become a language of its own, a space of shared understanding. She would sit by the fire, reading one of the ancient books from his shelves, and she could feel his gaze on her from across the room. Not hungry, not predatory. Watching, studying, as if she were a map to a land he desperately needed to find. Sometimes, she would risk looking up, and their eyes would meet. In those moments, the air would crackle, the unspoken tension between them, a living thing. A question hung in his silver eyes, a question he never dared to ask. What are you? She had no answer for him. She was beginning to ask herself the same thing. The girl who had arrived on the dais, trembling and broken, was slowly fading. In her place, someone new was taking root. The fear was still there, a constant hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer all-consuming. Here, in the heart of the monster's den, she was no longer Marin the worthless, Marin the wolfless Omega. Here, she was, the anchor, the key. She learned the rhythms of his pain. As the days passed, she could see the waxing moon through the high chamber window, a sliver of silver growing into a sickle, then a half-circle. With each passing night, the curse's hold on him grew stronger. The tension in his shoulders would return. He would pace the room for hours, a caged wolf fighting an invisible enemy. The low, guttural growls would return, torn from his throat when he thought she was asleep. On those nights, she would not stay in bed. She would rise, wrapped in the gray wolf cloak he had given her, and simply sit by the fire. She wouldn't speak. She wouldn't touch him. She would just be. Her quiet presence was a balm, her scent a shield. He would eventually stop his pacing and sink into his chair, the raw agony in his eyes softening into a weary, grateful exhaustion. He never acknowledged it. He never thanked her. But she knew. In the quiet darkness, with only the crackle of the fire between them, they were fighting the curse together. It was the night of the full moon that the truce shattered. The air itself felt different, tense, electric. A storm was gathering, not in the sky, but in the blood of the king. Arind had not left the chambers all day. He had stood by the high window, staring out at the snow-covered peaks, his body a rigid statue of black iron. He had not eaten. He had not spoken. Marin watched him, her own stomach a knot of anxiety. The peace she offered was a flickering candle against a hurricane. She feared tonight it would finally be extinguished. As dusk bled across the sky, painting the snow in shades of violet and blood, he turned from the window. His face was a pale, sweat-sheened mask of agony. The curse mark on his chest, visible beneath his unlaced tunic, was pulsing with a faint, malevolent light, even through the fabric. "You have to leave," he bit out, each word a struggle. Marin froze, her hand hovering over a book. "Leave? Where would I go?" "Anywhere." He stalked across the room, his movements jerky, uncontrolled. "Take the northern passage. There is a guard post 3 leagues from here. Tell them I sent you." He was trying to save her. He knew the beast was coming, stronger than it had ever been, and he was trying to get her out of the cage before it broke free. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it was hard as stone. The old Marin would never have dared. But the old Marin was gone. His head snapped up, his silver eyes blazing with a desperate, wild fire. "Do not argue with me, girl. This is not a request. I am not leaving you," she said, rising to her feet. She clutched the gray cloak around her shoulders, her only armor. "You foolish child," he roared, and the sound was half man, half beast. He slammed a fist against the stone wall, and cracks spiderwebbed out from the point of impact. "You do not know what it is you are offering to stay for. It will not be me in this room tonight. The thing that comes, it will not be soothed by your scent. It will be drawn to it. It will tear you apart to get to the peace inside you." The moon crested the mountain peak. A beam of pure, unfiltered silver light stabbed through the window, striking him in the chest. Arind screamed. It was a sound of pure, soul-shattering transformation, a sound of bones breaking and reforming, of a man's spirit being shredded to make way for the monster. He collapsed to his knees, his body convulsing. The curse mark on his chest erupted in a blinding silver-black light, the swirling, ink writhing like a nest of snakes. His features began to shift, to distort. His jaw elongated, his teeth sharpened into fangs. Claws burst from his fingertips, tearing through the skin. The beast was here, and it was glorious and terrible. It rose to its full height, larger than the man had been, its eyes no longer silver, but burning pools of moonlight and madness. It was a horrifying hybrid of man and wolf, a creature of nightmare given form. It turned its head, and its gaze fell upon her. A low, rumbling growl filled the room, a sound of pure, possessive hunger. This was not the king she had sat with in quiet companionship. This was the curse, and it knew what she was. It wanted its prize. It took a step toward her, its claws scraping against the stone floor. Maren stood her ground. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs, but she did not run. Running was useless. There was nowhere to go. There was only this room, this monster, and the impossible, foolish promise she had made to herself. "I am not leaving you." "Erend," she whispered, her voice trembling. The beast paused. It tilted its head, a flicker of confusion in its luminous eyes. The name was a dissonant note in its symphony of rage. It took another step, a snarl ripping from its throat, exposing long, sharp fangs. The confusion was fading, the hunger returning. She had to reach him, the man trapped inside. She did the only thing she could think of, the thing that had worked before. She walked toward it. One step, then another. The space between them shrank. The air grew thick with the scent of ozone, magic, and bloodlust. The beast watched her approach, its massive chest rising and falling with harsh, animalistic breaths. It was waiting, daring her. She stopped an arm's length away. She was so close, she could feel the heat rolling off its skin, see the madness churning in its eyes. She slowly, deliberately, let the gray cloak fall from her shoulders to the floor. She stood before it in her simple tunic, exposed and vulnerable. "A sacrifice. You told me the moon wanted my soul," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Here it is, but you will have to take it from him." She raised her hand. Not to his chest this time. She reached for his face, for the last remnants of the man. Her fingers touched his scarred cheek. His skin was burning hot, stretched taut over bones that were no longer entirely human. The beast roared, a sound of fury and pain, and swiped at her. Its claws, long and sharp as daggers, tore through the air. Too late. She froze, but the blow never landed. At the last possible second, its hand had stopped, trembling, an inch from her face. The king was fighting. From deep within the prison of his own body, Erend was fighting back. He was holding the beast's arm, refusing to let it harm her. A war was raging in that single, frozen moment. The beast's eyes stared into hers, and for a heartbeat, the pure moonlight madness wavered. A flicker of molten silver, agonized and desperate, broke through. "Help me." It was his soul, crying out from the depths of the storm. Maren did not pull her hand away. She pressed her palm against his cheek, ignoring the feral heat, the monstrous shape of him. She poured all of her will, all of the strange, quiet peace that lived inside her, into that single point of contact. "I am here, Erend," she whispered, her voice the only anchor in the howling dark. "I am not afraid." The beast threw back its head and roared, a sound of pure conflict, as the woman's touch and the king's will collided with the moon's ancient, hateful curse. The mark on his chest pulsed violently, a vortex of light and shadow, and the battle for the Alpha King's soul began. The roar was the sound of a universe being torn apart. It ripped through the chamber, shaking the very stones, a symphony of rage, agony, and confusion. The beast, the curse-given flesh, was at war with the man trapped inside, and Marine was standing at the epicenter of their cataclysm. Its claws, sharp enough to rend steel, remained frozen an inch from her face, trembling with the force of Erend's will. The muscles in its arm were locked, cords of stone straining against an unbreakable command from a prison of bone and flesh. The luminous, moon-mad eyes stared at her, and the battle was visible within their depths. The pure, cold light of the curse fought against a desperate, returning flicker of molten silver. The king was in there. He was drowning, but he was fighting. Her hand remained pressed to its cheek. Her own fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but she pushed it down. Fear was a luxury she could not afford. He needed her. "Help me." His silent plea echoed in her soul. "I am here," she repeated, her voice a fragile thread in the storm. "You are not alone in the dark." The beast snarled, a low, guttural sound of frustration. It could not strike her. It could not retreat. It was trapped between its insatiable hunger for her, peace, and its host's desperate command to protect her. It tried a new tactic. The massive body leaned closer, the monstrous face lowering to hers until its hot, foul breath washed over her. It was the scent of raw meat and old blood, the smell of the curse's endless appetite. "Flee," a voice whispered in her mind. It was not Aaron's. It was the curse itself, a sibilant, ancient thing that slithered through her thoughts. "He cannot hold me forever. I will feast on your bones. I will drink your quiet soul and leave him with the memory of your screams." It was trying to break her with fear, to make her run. If she ran, his resolve might shatter. "No," she whispered back, her voice for Aaron alone. "You promised to protect me. You are a king. A king does not break his promise." A tremor racked the creature's body, a human emotion conflict, warring with the divine madness. The hand frozen before her face slowly, painfully, began to retreat. The claws retracted back into the flesh, and the hand, still oversized and monstrous, fell to its side. She had won. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The beast was still in control, but she had reached the man. She had reminded him of who he was. Its eyes, however, still burned with the moon's light. The battle was far from over. It began to circle her, the way it had that first night. But this was not the controlled, assessing movement of the king. This was the restless pacing of a caged animal, its claws scraping grooves into the stone floor. It kept its distance, watching her, its massive head lowered. The curse was probing for another weakness. It stopped its pacing and looked around the room, its gaze falling upon the discarded gray wolf cloak on the floor. A low growl rumbled in its chest. It stalked over to the cloak, the symbol of his protection, and nudged it with its snout. It inhaled his scent, her scent, mingled on the fur. With a roar of fury, it lunged. Its fangs tore into the soft pelts, ripping and shredding the cloak into useless scraps. It was trying to destroy the bond between them, to erase the scent of the man, the king, leaving only the beast. Maren watched, her heart aching at the destruction of the one gentle thing he had given her. But she understood. The curse hated any reminder of the man it possessed. When the cloak was destroyed, the beast turned its attention back to her. It seemed larger now, more confident, as if destroying the symbol of his protection had given it strength. It moved to the great table, littered with the king's maps and scrolls. With a sweep of its massive arm, it sent everything crashing to the floor. Parchment, inkwells, daggers all scattered across the stones. It was erasing Aaron, erasing the evidence of his rule, his life, his mind. It wanted to leave nothing but itself, and then it would come for her. She had to do more than just stand there. She had to fight with him. An anchor had to hold. She walked slowly toward the center of the room, drawing its attention away from the remnants of Aaron's life. "You cannot have him," she said, her voice stronger now, imbued with a strange, fierce certainty. "His pain is not your food. His strength is not your cage. It is his own." The beast stilled, its head cocked, listening. She began to speak of him, of the man she had seen in the quiet moments between the full moons. "I have seen the king who stands guard in the dark so a stranger can sleep in peace," she said, her voice filling the silent chamber. "I have seen the warrior who bears a century of scars and still rises to face the dawn." The creature let out a low, uneasy whine. Her words were like stones cast into the still, mad pool of its consciousness, sending ripples of confusion. "I have seen the man who put his own cloak around my shoulders to shield me from the cold," she continued, her voice rising, gaining power. "A man who fights a monster every single night and has never, not once, surrendered." The beast flinched, taking a stumbling step back. The silver light in its eyes wavered violently. Aaron was listening. He was hearing her. Her belief in him was a weapon. More, his soul seemed to whisper. "Don't stop. The moon may have cursed your blood," she cried out, her voice ringing with defiance. "But she does not own your soul. It is yours, Aaron. It has always been yours. Fight for it." The beast roared, clutching its head in its hands, torn between the curse's rage and the king's awakening hope. The swirling mark on its chest blazed, a chaotic storm of black and silver. The transformation was becoming unstable. Its form began to shift, to flicker. For a second, the elongated snout would recede, a flash of the king's strong jawline visible, before the beast reasserted control. The claws would shrink back, only to burst forth again an instant later. He was fighting. He was using her words as a ladder, climbing out of the drowning depths of the curse. She took a step closer, then another, until she stood before the tormented creature once more. She wants my soul? Marin's voice dropped to a fierce, protective whisper. Then she will have to come through you. And I know you will not let her pass. She reached out again. This time she was not afraid. She placed both her hands flat on the curse mark on his chest. The contact was blinding. A scream, both his and the beast's, tore through the air as her peace met the curse's core. It was not a gentle soothing this time. It was a direct assault. Her scent, her essence, the very thing that quieted the howl, was flooding the source of his agony. It was like pouring pure, cool water onto a raging fire. The black and silver light of the curse erupted, throwing her backward. She landed hard on the stone floor. The air knocked from her lungs. Through blurry, swimming vision, she saw him. He was on his knees, his body convulsing violently. The transformation was reversing, but it was not a gentle process. It was a brutal, agonizing war of flesh and spirit. The monstrous form was being ripped away, torn from him piece by piece. Bones snapped and reformed with sickening cracks. Skin stretched and tore. He screamed until his voice was gone, a raw, ragged sound of a soul being flayed. And then it was over. The silver moonlight still streamed through the window, but the monster was gone. In its place knelt the king. He was naked, his body slick with sweat, trembling violently from the ordeal. The curse mark on his chest was no longer glowing. It was dull, dormant, just a swirl of black ink on his scarred skin. He slowly, painfully, lifted his head. His eyes, no longer burning with moonlight, found hers. They were pure, molten silver once more, and they were filled with a century of pain and a single, newly born moment of shattering gratitude. He had won. They had won. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse croak escaped his lips. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady, and stumbled toward her. He didn't stop until he was kneeling in front of her, where she lay on the floor. He gently reached out, his hand shaking, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His touch was hesitant, full of a reverence she did not understand. She had faced down his demon. She had not screamed. She had not run. She had called him home. He leaned down, his forehead coming to rest against hers. His breath was ragged, his body trembling, but his presence was an anchor. "Marin," he whispered, his voice a broken, ravaged thing. But it was his, the king's voice, and for the first time, in the quiet aftermath of the moon's rage, she did not flinch from his touch. She leaned into it, a silent acceptance passing between them. The night she was meant to die had become the night she chose to stay. The silence was a blanket now, warm, heavy, woven with the soft crackle of a morning fire and the sound of his breathing, a low and steady rhythm against her ear. Marin lay with her head on Aaron's chest, her hand resting over the mark that had once been his torment. It felt different beneath her palm. The skin was no longer fever-hot, the energy beneath it no longer a coiled, hateful thing. The swirling black ink was just that now, ink on the skin of the man she loved. 3 moons had waxed and waned since the night the beast had fallen. 3 full moons had risen, flooding their chamber with silver light, and he did not fight. He did not change. The first time, they had faced it together, braced for a war that never came. The moonlight had touched his skin, and the curse mark had pulsed with a soft, silver light not of madness, but of immense, controlled power. The beast was still there, a shadow in the back of his soul, but it no longer howled. It knelt. It was not a monster to be caged, but a part of him he had finally claimed. He had looked at her then, his silver eyes clear and sane, and had whispered, "It listens to you. Through me, it listens." Now, his arm was a heavy, warm weight around her shoulders. His fingers were tangled in her hair, his touch gentle, possessive. He was awake. She knew he was. He often woke before her, content to simply hold her, to breathe in her scent as if it were the very air that gave him life. "The council is waiting," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. She sighed, a soft sound of contentment. "Let them wait." A quiet chuckle answered her. The sound still new, still precious. "They have waited 100 years for a sane king. I suppose another hour won't hurt." She tilted her head back, looking up at him. The scars on his face were no longer fearsome. They were just part of the landscape she had come to know better than her own. His silver eyes held none of the old torment. They were filled with a fierce, unwavering light. A light that was all for her, "You are more than sane, Erend," she whispered, tracing the edge of the mark on his chest. "You are whole." He captured her hand, bringing her knuckles to his lips. His kiss was soft, a reverent promise. "Only because you were brave enough to gather the broken pieces." He sat up, pulling her with him. The furs pooled around their waists, the morning light from the high window painting them in strokes of gold. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the silence speaking volumes. It spoke of terrors faced and battles won, of a lonely king and a broken girl who had found their salvation in the most unlikely of places. Today, for the first time, she would leave these chambers, not as a prisoner, not as a secret. The servants had brought clothes for her, not a simple tunic, but a gown of deep forest green, the color of the pines that guarded his mountain. It was simple, elegant, and bore no crest. Her authority needed none. He dressed in the black leathers of his station, his movements sure and powerful. When he was ready, he turned to her. He did not offer his arm. Instead, he held out his hand, his scarred warrior's palm open and waiting. She placed her hand in his fingers closed around hers, a perfect familiar fit. Where his skin met her scars, there was no jolt of power, no fire, no ice. There was only warmth, a home. Together, they walked to the great iron-banded doors. He did not shove them open. He pulled them inward with a quiet strength, revealing the sunlit corridor beyond. They walked the halls of the fortress, side by side. Guards in black steel and wolf pelts, men who had averted their eyes from him in fear for a century, now stood taller. As they passed, each guard sank to one knee, their heads bowed not in terror, but in a profound, unshakable loyalty. Their gazes were fixed, not just on their king, but on the small, wolfless woman whose hand he held. They reached the doors to the great hall, the same hall where she had stood on a dais, a lamb waiting for slaughter. The guards swung the doors open. The hall was filled. The Pack's council, the elders, the warriors, all of them were assembled. 100 pairs of eyes turned to the entrance. A collective breath was drawn. They saw their Alpha King, no longer a figure of myth and dread, but a man radiating a calm and terrible power. The curse that had been his burden was now a mantle of authority, worn with an ease that silenced all doubt, and they saw the Omega at his side. Her head was held high, her gaze steady. She was not cowed. She was not afraid. She was the epicenter of the quiet storm of his strength, his anchor, his queen. He led her not to the dais, but to the very center of the hall. He stopped and turned to face his people. His voice, when he spoke, was not a roar, but a clear, commanding thunder that rolled to the farthest corners of the room. "You sent me a sacrifice to appease a curse," he said, his silver eyes sweeping over the assembly. "You were wrong. The moon did not send me a bride to be devoured." He turned his gaze down to Marin, and the love in his eyes was a fire that warmed the entire hall. She sent this kingdom its heart. He lifted her hand, the one with the faint, pale scars, and pressed a kiss to her wrist, directly over the marks of her old bindings. An act of devotion, a king's vow, made before his world. In that moment, the black mark on his chest seemed to shimmer in the light. It was not a vortex of pain. It was a king's crest. It was not a brand of shame. It was a shield, forged in agony and tempered by love. His curse had been a king's burden. Her love made it a crown.